November 1952, Monhegan Island, Maine. On a bald rise above the harbor, Anthony Bellocchio was pulling a black sail over his house. Not beside it, not across the yard, over the entire house. The house was already strange enough. A war surplus, Quonset hut, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel, dropped among cedar shingles, granite foundations, and weathered fishing sheds. But Tony had planted 12 spruce posts around it. He had bent ribs over the roof. He had left a gap of 16 inches between the wood frame and the steel. And now, with blocks, rope, and a hand-cranked winch, he was hauling 42 feet of waxed canvas over the entire structure. From the road, it looked less like construction than burial. Fishermen stopped to stare. One called it a funeral shroud. Another said the first winter gale would carry the whole thing to Nova Scotia. Then the county inspector arrived, looked at the black shell, and gave Tony until spring to tear it down. 3 months later, February brought the hardest storm the island had seen in years. Pipes burst across Monhegan. Stove wood vanished by the cord. The inspector's truck died in a ditch. But inside Tony's canvas-covered metal hut, bread dough was rising on the table. The details of this story are reconstructed. The principle is not. Tony understood something the men laughing at him did not. He was not trying to build a thicker wall. He was trying to make the wind miss the house. Anthony Bellocchio had spent most of the war as a Coast Guard sailmaker and deck rigger. He knew canvas the way a carpenter knew grain. He could judge tension by the note a rope made when he struck it with 2 fingers. He knew which knot would hold after 3 days of freezing spray. He knew how wet cotton ducks stretched, how paraffin stiffened in cold weather, and how a loose edge could beat itself to ribbons before dawn. What he did not know was how to build a New England house. That had not seemed important when he bought the Quonset hut. The government was selling them cheap. The hut came in curved steel panels, numbered in grease pencil, with bolts, ribs, and a diagram printed on paper thin enough to see daylight. Through, for a veteran with a wife, 2 children, and almost no money left after buying land, it looked like a miracle. Tony and his wife, Lena, set it on a concrete slab above the harbor. They lined part of the interior with salvaged boards. They hung curtains to divide the sleeping area from the kitchen. They installed a cast iron stove near the center and told themselves the arrangement would last 1 winter. The first cold week proved how wrong they were. A Quonset hut had been designed to go up fast. It had not been designed to feel kind. The steel skin cooled almost as quickly as the air outside. Every gust dragged heat off the curved roof. The stove could make the center of the room hot enough to sting the eyes, while the walls stayed cold enough to numb a hand through a glove. At night, warm indoor air struck the frozen metal and turned to water. Condensation gathered overhead. Then it fell not in a leak, everywhere. It ticked into tin cups. It darkened the blankets. It soaked the children's wool mittens where Lena had hung them to dry. By January, the inside of the hut had its own weather. Tony woke one morning to find a crust of ice on the nails above his pillow. A glass jar of milk left near the wall had frozen in a crescent on one side and stayed liquid on the other. Lena's bread refused to rise unless she set the bowl on a chair inches from the stove. Their son, Michael, slept in a wool cap. Their daughter, Anna, developed a cough that seemed to leave only when she did. The family burned 7 armloads of split spruce on the worst days. By midnight, the stove would be glowing. By 2 in the morning, the steel walls were pulling warmth from the room faster than the stove could replace it. Tony would lie awake, listening to the wind scrape across the roof. It did not sound like weather. It sounded like something trying to file the house away. The islanders had a simple explanation. The hut was not a house. A real house had clapboards, sheathing, plaster, timber, and weight. A real house had layers. Tony's had a single skin of metal between his children and the Atlantic. They were right about the weakness. They were wrong about the cure. Tony could not afford a timber house. He could not afford to fur out the entire interior, pack it with insulation, and rebuild the roof. But he had spent years watching wind strike temporary structures. He knew that wind rarely destroyed the strongest thing first. It found the edge. It found the seam. It found the surface it could keep touching. And once it could keep touching it, it kept taking. One night, while the stove settled into red coals, Tony remembered a convoy run in the North Atlantic. The weather had been cold, but the memory that returned was not about cold. It was about a double awning. A commander had ordered a canvas fly rigged over a deck house to keep spray from freezing against the steel door. The fly did not touch the deck house. It stood away from it on a light frame. The outer canvas took the wind. The air behind it stayed strangely quiet. The steel beneath remained less wet, less iced, and easier to handle. Tony had seen the same principle in the Pacific for the opposite reason. Canvas held above a metal deck kept the sun from striking the steel directly. The space between shade and metal changed everything. Hot climate, cold climate, same trick. Do not fight the temperature first. Break the contact. Tony sat up in the dark. The enemy was not only the cold air. The enemy was cold air moving at 40 miles an hour across a steel shell. If he could lift the wind off the metal, the hut might stop bleeding heat. The next morning, he walked the perimeter with a tape, a pencil, and a coil of line. Lena watched from the doorway. "What are you measuring?" Tony looked at the curved roof. "Distance. Between what?" He pointed to the hut. "And the weather." He began in September. First came 12 spruce posts, 6 on each side, set beyond the slab and sunk deep enough to survive frost heave. He selected straight trunks from an inland lot, peeled them, cut them to length, and soaked the lower ends in creosote. Then he built curved ribs that followed the shape of the hut without touching it. The new frame stood 16 inches away from the steel at the crown and slightly more near the lower walls. That gap mattered. Too narrow and wet canvas could slap against the metal. Too open and wind would churn through the cavity. Tony wanted a sheltered sleeve, not sealed tight, not loose, but controlled. People began walking the long way home to pass the property. At the store, men offered theories. He was building a second roof. He was making a greenhouse. He was preparing to raise pigeons. One fisherman studied the ribs and said Tony had finally admitted the hut needed a coffin. Tony kept working. The canvas came from a decommissioned patrol station. It was heavy cotton duck, waxed and treated for marine use, dark enough to look black under cloud. The full sheet measured roughly 42 by 54 feet. It weighed more than 300 pounds dry. Tony laid it across the grass and stitched 2 sections together with wax Sailmaker's thread. Every few feet he set a brass grommet. At the lower edge, he added rope reinforcement so the load would travel through the hem instead of tearing the cloth. He installed separate tension lines along both sides. That way, if the canvas stretched in rain or shrank in cold, he could correct one section without loosening the whole shell. This was not a tarp thrown over a roof. It was rigging. A roof carpenter would have nailed material down. Tony gave it controlled movement. A gust could load the canvas, but the load would travel into the frame, through the lines, and down into the posts. The surface could flex without flapping. That distinction was the difference between a sail and a rag. The day Tony raised the shell, half a dozen people watched. He fixed a gin pole near the front of the frame. He ran a block and tackle over the crown. Then he hauled. The black canvas rose inch by inch. It climbed the windward side, dragged over the upper ribs, and spilled down the far curve. For a moment, the entire sheet hung above the hut like a dark wave about to break. Then Tony took up the sidelines. The canvas tightened. Wrinkles disappeared. The surface became one clean arc from ground to ground. The steel house vanished beneath it. In its place stood something low, black and marine, part shelter, part hull, part enormous overturned boat. Nobody laughed for several seconds. Then Amos Reed arrived. Reed was the county building inspector, a narrow man with a careful mustache and the habit of pressing his lips together before disagreeing. He parked beside the road, took out a clipboard, and walked around the structure twice. He touched one of the guy lines. He looked at the treated cloth. He looked at the stovepipe passing through a metal collar. Tony had built well clear of the canvas. Then he looked at Tony. "What is it?" "A weather skin. It's a tent. It doesn't touch the house. That does not make it less of a tent." Tony wiped tar from his thumb. "It makes it work." Reed ignored that. He cited temporary structure rules, fire exposure, wind liability, and the absence of anything in the county handbook resembling a residence inside a marine awning. Tony showed him the metal flashing around the stovepipe. He showed him the ventilation openings at the lower edges. He showed him the independent timber frame. Reed wrote anyway. The notice gave Tony until April 1st to remove the canvas enclosure. Lena read it at the kitchen table. "What happens if they fine us?" Tony looked toward the wall. A drop of condensation formed on a bolt head. But this time it did not fall. The weather outside had turned colder during the afternoon. Yet the steel was merely cool. Not white with frost, not sweating. Just cool. Tony touched it with the back of his fingers. "We get through winter first." That night the stove burned low. The hut stayed warm. The next morning there was no rain from the ceiling. Not less. None. Lena set bread dough on the table instead of balancing it over the stove. By noon it had climbed above the rim of the bowl. The change was immediate. But Tony did not trust one calm day. He watched for wind. It came 2 nights later. A northeast blow crossed the harbor hard enough to shake shutters on the village side. Outside, the black canvas bowed slightly between the ribs. The tension lines hummed. Inside the gap, the air remained quiet. The wind was no longer scraping heat directly from the steel. The outer skin took the impact. The sheltered cavity slowed the exchange. The metal shell, freed from direct wind pressure and freezing spray, stayed closer to the temperature of the air inside. That did 3 things at once. It reduced wind-driven heat loss. It reduced condensation, and it stopped the steel walls from feeling sheets of ice radiating cold into the room. The canvas itself was not magic. The air gap was not a miracle insulation value. The system worked because Tony had separated the weather layer from the living layer. He had taken the most violent part of the climate, the moving air, and made it spend its force somewhere else. For the rest of November and December, Tony kept notes on a scrap ledger: outside temperature, wind direction, how many armloads of wood went into the stove, whether water formed on the ceiling. On comparable cold days, The family used 3 or 4 armloads instead of 7. The hut held near 60 degrees through the evening, without driving the stove red. The corners stopped smelling damp. Anna's cough eased. Lena stored flour near the wall, without finding the sack wet in the morning. Every result made the inspector's notice look less like authority and more like a countdown. Then February came. The storm formed south of Cape Cod and deepened fast. By afternoon the harbor had turned white. By night, sustained wind was pushing past 50 miles an hour, with stronger gusts folding spray over the rocks. The ferry stopped running. Telephone lines sagged under salt ice. Snow did not fall straight down. It crossed the island sideways, packed into door latches, and filled the lee sides of stone walls until the walls disappeared. For 4 days, Monhegan became a small white prison in the Atlantic. Houses built of good timber suffered. The wind found old window weights and loose clapboards. It drove powdered snow through keyholes. Water pipes froze in north walls. Families closed bedrooms and slept near kitchen stoves. At the Mercer house, a chimney fire started after they fed wet spruce into an overheated range. At the harbor store, 2 kerosene cans had to be brought indoors because the pumps stiffened with ice. The island did not run out of fuel. It ran out of places that could hold heat. Tony's black shell took the gale head-on. The canvas tightened until the line sang. Ice formed on the windward face. Then the flexing skin cracked it loose in plates that slid toward the drip edge. The frame moved slightly. It did not rack. The grommets held, the hem held, the posts held. Inside, the family heard the storm as a deep pressure, not 1,000 fingernails scratching steel. Tony fed the stove at a steady pace. The thermometer near the kitchen table held at 63 degrees. A kettle simmered. Lena dried 2 pairs of socks on a line. Michael built a fort from apple crates. Anna lay on the floor drawing a ship with a roof shaped like a second sail. And on the table, under a cloth, bread dough rose. That bowl became the simplest proof in the house. The year before, dough had to be guarded beside the stove. Now it rose in the middle of the room, while the island froze around it. On the 3rd afternoon, Amos Reed was making welfare checks in a county truck fitted with chains. He had already helped one elderly couple thaw a pump line. He had inspected a cracked chimney near the school. He was heading back toward the harbor when a gust pushed the truck sideways on glazed stone. The rear wheels dropped into a shallow ditch. The engine stalled. Reed tried to restart it. The starter turned once, then slower, then not at all. The nearest occupied building was the one he had ordered dismantled. He sat behind the wheel for nearly a minute, staring through snow at the black curve on the hill. Then he pulled his scarf over his mouth and stepped outside. The cold struck before he reached the road. Snow needled his eyes. His gloves were already wet from clearing the wheels. He leaned into the gale and moved toward Tony's property. Not because he wanted to ask for help, but because the curved shell offered the only reliable windbreak within sight. He reached the lee side and pressed himself against the lower frame. The change was startling. The storm still roared overhead, but the air beside the canvas barely moved. The black cloth formed a calm pocket. Reed put one gloved hand against it. He expected frozen stiffness. Instead, the surface gave slightly. It was cold, but it was not ice cold. More important, the air behind it did not feel like the air he had just crossed. He crouched near a small inspection flap Tony had built into the lower edge. Warmth did not pour out. That was not what amazed him. What amazed him was the absence of violence. No moving air, no spray, no steel skin being stripped by the gale. Just a quiet layer between the storm and the house. Reed lifted the flap. A few inches beyond the canvas stood the curved metal wall. He touched it. Cool. Dry. Not sweating. Not frosted. He kept his hand there longer than necessary. The explanation arrived before pride could stop it. Tony had not insulated the hut in the ordinary sense. He had removed it from the wind. Reed stood and knocked. The door opened. Tony wore a flannel shirt, with the sleeves rolled once at the wrist. Warm lamplight spread across the snow. Behind him, Michael was laughing. A kettle clicked softly on the stove. Reed smelled yeast. He looked past Tony and saw the bowl on the table, the cloth rounded by rising dough. For a man who had spent 2 days entering frozen houses, the sight was almost offensive. "How warm is it in here?" 63. Reed took off one glove. "How much wood?" "3 armloads since morning." Reed stepped inside. Lena handed him a towel for his hands. Tony poured coffee. For several minutes the inspector said nothing. He listened to the stove. He watched the children. He looked at the dry steel overhead. Then he unfolded the citation notice from his coat pocket. The paper had gone damp at the edges. "You kept the clearance around the pipe? 18 inches to metal flashing. More to cloth. Lower vents stay open? Always. Frame independent from the hut? Completely." Reed looked toward the wall again. "You built the weather outside the building." Tony shook his head. "No." He lifted his cup. "I gave it somewhere else to go." Reed did not withdraw the notice that afternoon. Men like Amos Reed did not reverse themselves quickly, especially in another man's kitchen. But he asked questions. Exact questions. Post depth. Canvas. Drainage. Vent openings. How the lower hem was secured. What happened when the cloth got wet. How much the sidelines had to be eased after freezing rain. Tony answered everyone. By the time the storm weakened, Reed had filled 3 pages of his clipboard. In March, the county board came to inspect the structure. They expected a dispute. Instead, Reed walked them around the shell and explained the load path. He pointed out the independent frame. He demonstrated the inspection flap. He showed the stovepipe collar and the ventilation gap. He described the difference between an attached fabric enclosure and a freestanding weather screen. The same man who had called it a tent now insisted the board judge the system by what it actually did. The removal order was suspended. Then it was replaced with conditions. The canvas had to remain tensioned. The lower cavity had to stay ventilated. The stove clearance had to be checked each autumn. Tony agreed to all of it. He had never objected to safety. He had objected to being misunderstood. That summer, 3 veterans from nearby islands visited the Bellocchio property. One lived in another Quonset hut. One had converted a metal equipment shed into a workshop. The third owned a fish house so exposed that salt froze on the inside walls. Tony did not sell them plans. He walked them around the frame. He made them place a hand inside the cavity. He showed them where water had to leave, where air had to move, and where cloth must never approach a hot flue. He repeated one warning more than any other. The canvas is not the insulation. Then he tapped the black skin. This only makes the wind spend itself here. By the following winter, 5 weather screens stood along the Maine coast. They were not identical. One used painted sailcloth. One used overlapping tarred panels. One man built a narrower cavity because his site was sheltered. But the reports were consistent. Less ceiling condensation. Lower fuel use. Fewer frozen tools. Rooms that stayed livable after the stove settled down. Across those 5 buildings, the proof accumulated not in a dramatic patent or a magazine photograph, but in ordinary winter measures. Woodpiles lasted weeks longer. Blankets stayed dry. Morning water remained liquid. Children stopped wearing coats at the table. Modern builders would recognize the logic. A ventilated rain screen, a double-skin envelope, a sacrificial weather layer, a buffered cavity. The terms sound sophisticated because modern construction has learned to name what practical people once discovered with rope, cloth, and attention. Tony had no computer model, no thermal camera, no laboratory. He had a steel hut, a family that was cold, and 20 years of knowing what wind could do to a surface. That was enough. The islanders had looked at the black canvas and seen a weak material. Tony had looked at the same material and seen a way to redirect force. They thought strength meant adding mass. He thought strength meant controlling contact. They wanted the house to resist the storm. He made the storm pass over something else. Anthony Bellocchio did not build a warmer wall. He taught the wind to miss the house.